Finally, Slaanesh. I have been waiting for years for this moment. Unless you are new to this channel, you know that Nurgle is my favorite Chaos faction, but Slaanesh has always been a close second. Especially their demons always fascinated me. And now that we have this new 40k faction, even though it feels a little like half a faction after looking into the codex, I finally have an excuse to paint some pink. And trust me, I'll paint a lot of pink in the next few weeks. I couldn't wait to get my hands on these Slaanesh Marines. They have sleeker designs than their friends. These two pictures will forever give me the same vibes. Sorry, but now seeing this more credible design direction with less wonky proportions made me really happy and actually excited to paint some chaos again. Also, they are just a little less cluttered than the generic Space Marines, and finally I can tell where the armor ends and imitation begins. And I know this is not everyone's cup of tea, but they do stand a little taller than their rotund brothers and don't look inferior next to Primaris Marines. Actually, I think they are a little taller than Primaris Marines. Okay, well, that's not gonna make anyone mad. So today, not only do I get to paint some pink boys, we can also finally settle the question of whether or not Chaos Space Marines can be painted with my Grimdark approach. This must be one of the most requested videos on this channel. Every time I so much as whisper the words grim and dark, comments were just flooding in asking me to show how it could be done on Chaos Space Marine. Now, I'm not gonna lie, this is a technique that really shines on large areas of flat armor, so regular Space Marines and even better Terminator armor. But large flat areas is not something Chaos Space Marines dabble in, because apparently you can only join the Chaos Club if you're wearing an ungodly amount of trims on your armor. Honestly, I think there is some guy in the Eye of Terror whose entire job is just hammering extra trims onto Trader Astartes, like some sort of cursed blacksmith, condemned to an eternity of needless decoration.
By will of the Dark Gods, this armor requires 800% more fancy borders.
Another thing this messes with is the usual way I try to create some readability within the minis, by focusing the weathering on the edges and making them darker. So adapting the techniques to these circumstances will be the main challenge of this video. Maybe it's even impossible, like teaching a Khorne Berserker the concept of indoor voice. But let's find out while I paint these two prototypes, one Tormentor and an Infractor variant. Now, I said in my faction review video on my second channel, these Marines do not have as many trims as other Astartes of the Tainted ilk, but they still are loaded with a lot of other detail, like the stretched skin and the more contorted backpacks. Now, in case you have been lost in the warp for a few years and don't know what my Grimdark approach is yet, first of all, welcome back. I hope you didn't bring any demons with you, but it's a way to paint miniatures fast in a very gritty way without drowning them in oils and enamels, which usually results in very muted colors and everything looking the same. While here we are only using acrylics and we are retaining most of the color intensity and definition. And I think this is a much better approach to achieve that gritty result, because this way the army looks battle hardened without making your minis look like they were dragged through a Nurgle infested trench for 6 weeks. Oh, and thanks a lot to my local game store and partner in crime, Siren Games, for helping me acquiring this box. Since I'm not getting any review copies by Games Workshop anymore, this has helped a lot. I'll leave a link in the description. Check them out. Awesome store and pretty reliable pillar of the local Warhammer community. Before painting these, I wanted to add a little flavor. So after drilling out the barrel of the plasma gun, I grabbed these flames by Epic Basing that I printed out and checked some options I had for representing barrel smoke. This one was a good fit, so I cut it from the bigger part, glued it in, and filled the little gaps that were left. I have a lot of these pillar tops left over from Kill Team terrain, and I like them for ground plates. I wanted a little slope that would fit the mini's pose, and it was perfect for that. I broke the plate up a bit to make it smaller and for it to be more compact on the base, and the smaller pieces would make for good rubble the larger part could rest on to create the slope I needed. After breaking it apart, I scorched the edges a bit so it would look more like this has been damaged by some violent event. Then I bulked up the terrain and glued down the plates and added some battlefield obstacles, also from Epic Basing, to add additional detail and variety. And when adding the sand filler, I also made sure to dump some into the recesses of the plate, as you would definitely have some dirt collecting there on a battlefield. I also wanted to try some concrete or asphalt texture on the second base to cover the cork, so I applied some ammo premium texture and sanded it down once it was dry. And that was the basis pretty much done. And even though this would be for gaming, I like to create bases that support the poses of each individual figure, because I feel like this adds an additional layer of interest to an army. I'm starting from my trusty mix of Rhinoxide and Mournfang Brown. There's a few exceptions when I start from different colors, and I'll link this video in the description that explains it all. But here the standard mix is fine, and you can apply this any way you want. I usually use an airbrush or the makeup sponge over black primer. Of course, you can use a brush. If you're painting in bulk, using a brown primer will save you one step, if you can find a proper tone that you like. And starting from brown creates the underpainting that will shine through the main color and practically is part of the first day of weathering. And as you can see, I switched to the brush for some harder to reach areas, and I would recommend just trying a few brown tones initially, like you could mix different ratios of Mournfang Brown and Rhinoxide, or you can also have some of the black shining through. From having taught this approach to thousands of people, I know that some like to start from a darker, almost black mix, and some like a more lighter rust brown, and so on. I like to stick to Citadel paints with these Grimdark videos as much as possible, as I know that a lot of you are eager to also try it on their own minis. So here I went with a mix of Sigvald Burgundy and Pink Horror as the base color. This is a relatively dark color, and since part of it is a contrast paint, we also have some transparency that will help with letting the brown shine through. As always, I'm starting with a piece of sponge that I ripped out of a larger chunk, because I can cover a lot of ground that way quickly. And I just love the jagged texture it creates. As always, after picking up a good portion of paint, I dab it on a piece of paper or paper towel to get rid of most of it, so the specks this leaves are smaller and not just one giant blob. And as I dab the sponge on, you can see exactly the buildup of texture that I want from this effect. Of course, as I do this, I think about what parts of the armor would get banged up, and I leave more of the brown to show in these areas. At one point, sooner or later, with this way of painting, I almost always switch to the brush, simply because you just can't reach all of these areas with the sponge. So what I do is I use this flayed synthetic brush and also take a similar approach, making sure my brush is loaded, but that there isn't too much paint. And next time gradually going brighter with the main color, covering less and less area. For this first brighter layer, I simply mixed in more Pink Horror and covered everything I could reach with the sponge again, and then switched to the brush for tighter spaces. When I heard that there will be a new Slaanesh release for 40k, I got really excited, and I started planning ahead and collected a ton of inspirational material. But every time I do this, I feel like eventually I forget what I have collected, because let's be honest, most of the time I'm a mess and I'm really bad at self-organizing. So this time I went ahead and tried Milanote, an online organization tool. Milanote was designed to brainstorm, plan and collaborate on projects, and it really helped me to flesh out the rough ideas I had in mind. I started by listing every project I had planned, and I love that you can just copy and paste video URLs to similar approaches, so everyone that works on this board can get the idea right away. Then I started to collect visual inspiration. You can just drag pictures that you save on your hard drive into your board and arrange them any way you want. If you find something in your browser, you can drag it right from there. And collecting my references like this means I have them all spread out and can look over them and get the big picture, or I can look at them one by one. In any case, collected like this, my inspiration will never be lost in the void that is my hard drive again. Once I had my initial ideas collected, I started to analyze the references for colors I would need to use and started browsing for them. Amazingly, I can just take a screenshot and copy paste it into my board and drag and drop it anywhere I want. And I could just link the pictures of the paint with the areas I plan to use them on and add a little note that would describe what I had in mind for them. And I can also add notes with more detailed descriptions, because Milanote lets you invite others to cooperate and work on the same project. And even when I want to expand my reference section, like if I drag this out for better visibility, or if I want to rearrange it, everything stays connected and I don't have to redo everything. For someone like me that prefers visual cues over everything else, the option to just be able to scribble bullet points and do some sketching over all of this helps a lot. And since everyone is different in how they want to structure their projects, Milanote accommodates different ways of thinking and organizing your ideas. So Milanote offers pre-made templates to account for that. There's something to get you started, no matter what you need it for. Filmmaking, writing, interior design, or planning your next Warhammer army. Milanote is available for free without any limit, and you can sign up using the link in the description to start planning your next creative project right away. So while this is a quick way to get paint down on some plastic crack, I want to stress that I don't necessarily consider this a speed painting technique, at least not the way I do it. I consider it a way to paint minis that creates an awesome effect, especially if you are looking for a more down-to-earth, I don't want to say realistic, but probably credible way to paint armor. So my point is, I'm spending a bit of time to get the paint in all the tight spots, but I also make sure all areas are highlighted in a credible way. Here on the shoulder guard, that means placing the highlights more on the upper areas where more light would hit. The same goes for the chest plate, for example. And another thing is that I like to put some highlights on these inverted edges, since while corrosion might accumulate there, you don't usually get these areas to be banged up, so I like to keep them intense and bright by letting some highlight color run into the recesses. So for the last two steps of highlights, I used pure pink horror and a 50-50 mix of pink horror and this medium skin tone. That results in a slightly yellow finish. What I love about this way to paint is that you can learn a lot of what makes a miniature look good without any stress or having to strive for these perfect blends. Like here on the helmet, I'm just having fun with the shapes, placing highlights fast and loose, and I'm not paying too much attention to smoothness. I'm just making sure they're in credible places, so apex points on the beak, and the capsule, and bent parts, and the curved parts, and on any flat areas that face straight up. I wanted most of the armor parts to be pink, mainly of course so I could illustrate the process properly. But since we are dealing with Emperor's children here, I would throw in a few black elements. And I simply started from pure black, sponging it over the brown, and leaving some to shine through as usual. And then I highlighted that with extra dark green by AK Interactive. This just fits really well for highlighting black, as it is not a neutral gray and has a bit of color in it. Plus it fits this paint job in particular, since turquoise and green would be in my scheme, so the stark green would actually fit my limited palette. For the brightest parts, I added a little basic skin tone to get a brighter mix, and I just added a few dabs in the highlight area. And speaking about limited palettes, I used Rhinoxide and Athena Skin as a base color for the stretched skin parts. And what I did was I tried to paint lines on the surface, kind of tracing where it would stretch due to how it was mounted and draped around these rivets. I highlighted that up with pure skin tone and added a little white for specular highlights. I wanted to keep the mini coherent with the base, so I defined the plate on the ground in a very similar way, both as far as paint application goes, but also when it comes to colors. So I sponged on some extra dark green that I already used on the black as a base color, and then gradually added more turquoise and the brightest color being mint green. This is a really intense result, and you could leave it that way, but I toned it down with a few washes of burnt umber and burnt sienna. The mini is definitely in the ugly phase at this point. It's kind of hard to imagine how this will come together in the end, but that's mainly due to the fact we need to do some cleanup and fill a lot of these trims and symbols, and only 70 to 80% of the mini has paint on it. So the main concern here is that this technique does shine a lot on larger armor plates and surfaces, and that's why we have a bit of a hard time here. But I guess we just have to accept that it is not going to be as straightforward like sponging Terminator armor, and creating the armor effect is just part of the process and not all of the process. So the tricky part is to find the balance between how much area to cover, or rather where you can focus more on creating the worn effect and where it's better to cover more surface with the pink and focusing less on the texture. For example, on the legs we can go all out with the sponging, going from dark to bright and having some of the darker color to shine through, is simply because there's more room for the effect to do its magic. But on the chest area where we don't have that much space because of the trim, it's better to focus on the main color to cover more area. Otherwise we will just look too messy, and we do want the armor to read as pink after all. just a really worn and battered pink. But to sell the effect, it's enough to do it all the way in some places and then dial it back where other aspects like volumetric highlights are more important, or it's simply more difficult to do. Whenever there was no trims on edges, I would use some black to darken them. I like to do this because it defines the edges against the other brighter armor plates. Normally, definition and readability on a mini comes from shading and edge highlights. With this approach, we don't really have edge highlights though. So going the opposite direction, making the edges dark, is actually our workaround to still being able to distinguish the armor plates against each other. So I knew I wanted to use gold in my scheme, but at the same time I didn't want it to be too yellow, too warm. More like a muted, desaturated gold. And I just got a few iconic smart colors for review, and the brass was exactly what I was looking for. So I gave all the trims 2 layers of that, and I think it's a good fit because it's muted, and just look how reflective it is. And of course, this needs some depth, and I had a good idea about what to do about that. My new go-to for an almost no-brainer wash is mixing regular paint with Speed Paint Medium by the Army Painter. And this works best with inks, so my starting point was a mix of black ink and burnt umber. I was not entirely sure about the result I wanted, but hey, I had 2 minis so I could try different mixes without worrying too much. On the infractor, my mix leaned more towards umber, so the result looked a bit more yellow. And I like it. It has a lot of richness and warmth in it, but I also wanted to see how a more desaturated and cooler result would fit. So on the Tormentor, I used a mix that was leaning heavier into the black ink, and I think that was an even better fit. I started from a more diluted mix for my first layer, and wherever I wanted a darker shade, I added a second and third layer. I really like how the Speed Paint Medium helps with the flow of the inks and how you can create smooth transitions very easily. I slapped a relatively thick layer of this mix on the sword and the rest of the metallics, and then sponged a few chips on for some structure. Putting more focus on the sharper edges by putting down more chips closer together, ultimately making these areas brighter. I like how simple but very effective this is. I give most of the steel metallics a wash of Sigval Burgundy to give them a magenta shine and more richness. Basically again using a color I already had in my palette to draw everything together, and then use the brighter metallic paint to define the edges. To round everything out, I also put a couple of strokes of pure brass on the gold areas to add some shine back and add additional detail. And speaking about detail, with the bulk of the paint job done, I still had the plasma rifle to paint, and I wanted that to stand out. My idea was to add a hot pink glow to the plasma coil, which is why I had to start from white to get a really intense color going. And I usually do this by using oil paint because it's really easy to apply it, especially in the recesses, and it's easy to fix spill. So I was mixing up a little paint with some thinner, and covered the coil at the recesses around the nozzle. See how the paint creeps into the crevices and leaves the higher up parts a little darker? And that's going to help with the hot glow effect. And wherever I had some spill, a cotton swab soaked in a little thinner would easily fix that. Now obviously the oil paint needs some time to set before I can work over it. So I thought now was a good time to add some decals to the shoulders, and I could have sworn that there was some white Slaanesh symbols on this sheet, but nope. The brightest one was pink. So I went with the pink one for the black shoulder and the black one for the pink shoulder on the Tormentor. I soaked the cotton swab in microsol, and using some rolling motions I made sure there was no air trapped under the decal to avoid the dreaded silvering, and also to avoid crimping because microsol dissolves and softens the decal a bit so it conforms more to the non-flat and curved surfaces. Once that was done, I painted the pink Slaanesh symbol white and added a little chipping, so they wouldn't look too pristine compared to the rest of the armor. So this is an optional step in my opinion, but I really wanted a bit more turquoise in this scheme, so I started adding verdigris to the gold trims, starting from this dark mix of turquoise and burnt umber, and applying it over the darkest parts of the gold, and then later gradually going brighter. I also wanted to add some streaking, particularly over the black shoulder and white symbol. And thinking about where to start the streaking, I decided to go for that top rivet and pull down a wider line of the darker turquoise mix, resting my fingers on the mini so I could do a steady stroke and then pull the brush down with very long motions so the lines will be as straight as possible. And after that first wider line, I painted on more confined ones with a brighter mix until I was happy with the result. At that point it was time to go back to the plasma gun. I took my airbrush and built up a halo around the plasma coil, and I also extended that glow to areas right opposite of the coil, which becomes a light source in this composition. And then I covered all of the white with fluorescent pink using the airbrush. And I also let that run into all the recesses I couldn't reach with the airbrush. So as light radiates out, its intensity decreases with the inverse square of distance, which is known as the inverse square law, and is just a fancy way to say the further away a feature from the light source, the darker. So I needed to tone down some of the bright pink area as it radiated outward, and I did that by airbrushing on a haze of purple fluo on the edge of the pink. Now any edge that is next to or facing the light source will be very bright, and that's why I put some pure white on these features. Where the coils turned a bit cooler, I added a mix of fluorescent pink and a little black, and then I covered all the white edges in pure pink by brush. And I also needed some white on the hottest part of the plasma. To finish the base, I dumped a lot of pigment on it and made sure there also was some in the recesses of the ground plate. And then to fix it in place, I drowned everything in matte varnish thinned with water. There was still a few details left to do that I mostly worked on with green fluo paint, establishing an initial layer of dark turquoise over black, and then adding some pure white that I later covered with a few thin layers of fluorescent green. I also made that bottle around his waist really glowy with the same technique, as well as the syringe containing all the good stuff. I mean, if it wasn't the good stuff, would it glow like that? I wanted this to look like a transparent vial, so I laid out the part containing the liquid, including the surface line with turquoise, and then traced that line with white, and also added white to the bottom of the vessel, where I wanted it to be the brightest, with some turquoise still showing in the transition area. And then I gave that sketch 2 layers of fluorescent green and added some white reflections on the vial, as well as some subtle glow coming from it on the armor. And the eye lenses already had a touch of dark magenta, probably because I touched them a bit while I was painting the base color of the armor. So all I had to do was add a lower outline with a skin color and then layered fluorescent pink over that. Now that looks like some dark lenses where some of the plasma glow is reflecting. I also added a reflection dot in the top using extra dark green as a base and some pure white highlight. And that leads us right into the results showcase. So can you do this method on Chaos Space Marines and will it still look great? Well, we already established that this is a bit less effective on these tight spaces. I still like these results though. Yeah, it's a bit tricky, but I thought of getting rid of a few trims in some of these more obscene Chaos Space Marines in the future, so they're a bit closer to how the new Emperor's Children Marines look. where they don't have trims on the lower parts of the legs, for example. And again, if you can show the effect on some parts that have a bigger area, like the pauldrons, for example, you can go a little easier with the effect in other and smaller areas. And considering this is a really unique approach and rather different from most other ways to paint, I still think it is worth doing it on armies. It's relatively fast, you don't need any special products, and it feels like you are actually painting and deciding things creatively, instead of just going through the steps of a base layer, wash, edge highlights, and then dumping a lot of streaking grime on it, or dry brushing on black and white and putting a layer of contrast paint on. Again, that's perfectly fine if you want to be fast, but if you are looking for something that lets you express yourself through painting, like I am, that might just not be fulfilling enough for you. In any case, let me know what you think about these and whether or not you have tried this way to paint already, or if you think on doing so. I'd be curious to hear about how it worked out for you. And I hope you'll find as much joy with this painting approach as I did over the years. Thanks for watching, keep pushing that pigment, and I'll see you in the next one.